presentation session 4B. So hopefully this is where you're all expecting to be, but it's going to be a really interesting two sets of presentations that we've got this afternoon in this session. So first of all, I'd like to welcome up Jonathan Franklin, who's the librarian at the National Gallery.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. So my paper is entitled, as you can see, Museum Libraries and Library History, Joining the Research Conversations at the National Gallery. Changing roles are a feature of museum libraries today. 2 years ago, ARLIS NA, North America, published a white paper on the state of art museum libraries in response to, I quote, reports of a large number of layoffs and detrimental restructuring in the art museum library community, end quote. Although the report only covered art museum libraries in the United States, many of the challenges can be replicated in other countries. The traditional role of supporting curatorial research is still key, but the importance of research to curators and to the museum, and the status of curators within the museum, have not stood still in recent years. Evolving from a passive to a more active role is one way in which museum libraries can navigate these shifting tides. This presentation will describe ways in which the National Gallery Library is adapting itself to join the research conversations within the institution, as well as in the wider arenas of art history and library history. So my paper will cover broadly 6 points as follows: the Eastlake Library, a brief introduction; cataloguing, exposing the records online; digitization, selecting what to digitize; collaboration, the Digital Chiconyara project; publication, getting our own research out there; and finally, number 6, creating opportunities, a collaborative doctoral partnership. So firstly, the Eastlake Library, a brief introduction. Sir Charles Eastlake, and there he is, 1793 to 1865, was the first director of the National Gallery from 1855 until his death. He had been an avid collector of books since his youth, and he lived for a number of years in Rome as a practicing artist, where he associated with German as well as Italian artists and art historians. During his 10 years as director of the National Gallery, he made annual trips to continental Europe, especially to Italy, chiefly to acquire paintings for the gallery, but also along the way collecting books to add to his library. Being fluent in several European languages, he acquired books in English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Dutch. In 1865, Eastlake died, still in post as director, in the middle of one of his tours to Italy. His widow, Lady Eastlake, wished to ensure that his pioneering work at the National Gallery would continue and be respected. After some negotiations, she sold the library to the gallery on condition that it be known as the Eastlake Library. And she personally stamped every volume with a distinctive E stamp, and there it is on the screen, on Valentine's Day 1870, which makes it very easy for us to identify the books. And the Eastlake Library has been at the heart of the National Gallery library collections ever since its acquisition. The original Eastlake Library numbers some 2,030 volumes covering a wide range of publications and formats. Monographs, collection and auction catalogues, treatises, periodicals, technical and travel literature, pamphlets, off-prints, as well as a few manuscript volumes, chiefly transcripts of unpublished source materials. These all reflect Eastlake's broad-ranging interests in the developing field of art history, especially in relation to his concerns about attribution and provenance research, and in the history of artistic techniques. Although it's a working library for research, rather than a rare books collection, the library includes 2 incunabula, one of which is the Hypnerotomachia polyphili, I do practice saying that word, printed in Venice in 1499. There are numerous volumes which are either unique or held in few libraries either in the United Kingdom or worldwide, and a good number of the volumes are annotated by Eastlake himself, especially the guidebooks and catalogues which accompanied or derived from his travel to the European continent. Secondly, cataloguing, exposing the records online. As part of the process of acquiring the Eastlake Library back in 1870, a printed catalogue was compiled by a bookseller, George Green, and published in 1872. There it is. In 2012, I should say this is before I worked at the National Gallery, a complete PDF version of this catalogue was posted on the National Gallery's website. However, Green's catalogue entries are very brief, and researchers would have to be persistent or fortunate or both to stumble across the PDF file. So there were limits to how useful this actually was. And I should put this in context by saying the general catalogue of the National Gallery Library has only been publicly available on the internet since last November. We're now in the third phase of a retrospective conversion project. In deciding what to prioritise in the process of converting our catalogue records from paper to electronic, we had to take various things into consideration. Firstly, contrary to the expectations of many members of the public who ring us up, we're not the National Art Library. We operate more or less as a library of last resort. Secondly, of those rare and hard to find books that we do wish to encourage potential readers to come and consult, many are in the Eastlake Library. Consequently, we determined at the outset that the Eastlake Library should be the focus of a rare books cataloguing project, and also one of the principal drivers for making the whole library catalogue publicly available. With private funding, we employed a rare books cataloguer to either create new catalogue records or enhance existing ones for the entire Eastlake collection. The records follow rare books cataloguing standards, including provenance information, notes about inscriptions, stamps, bookplates, and inserted ephemera. Thirdly, digitisation, selecting what to digitise. As an adjunct to this rare books cataloguing project, we've also digitised 17 early National Gallery collection catalogues from 1824 to 1850. As part of a gallery-wide collections information project designed to move more of the gallery's information holdings about the art collection from print to online, the library employed a 6-month cataloguer to provide online catalogue records for all the gallery's publications from 1824 up to the present day. The cataloguer was also asked to check the World Wide Web for digital versions of early collections catalogues from the mid-19th century. And in fact, we found that none of the early catalogues was out there in digital form. And I should say a typical question we have to deal with from researchers from time to time is, how was a particular painting catalogued over time? For example, during the first 20 years of its life in the gallery's collection, did the attribution change as a result of advances in connoisseurship or scientific inquiry? Did the title change as a result of reinterpretation of its subject? To answer such a question, a researcher may ask to see all the printed catalogues from 1850 to 1870, for example. Once they have all the dozen or so catalogues lined up on a trolley, it takes them maybe no more than 10 minutes to flip through the pages. A lot of retrieval and reshelving on our part, not to mention wear and tear on the originals for the sake of a cursory inspection. All this is simplified by offering access to digital versions, which are linked to the online library catalogue. The scans are text searchable using standard PDF commands. Text searching does not include any manuscript annotations, which may nevertheless be of interest to researchers. For example, our copy of the 1847 short catalogue includes annotations by the 19th century art historian Anna Jameson. We will be continuing this initiative by digitising catalogues after 1850 in the years to come. Fourthly, collaboration, the Digital Chickanyara project. Digitisation of rare titles from the Eastlake Library is also one projected outcome of our participation in the Digital Chickanyara project. Some of you may be familiar with this initiative in its previous guise as the Leopoldo Chickanyara Library Collection on microfiche, produced by Chadwick Healy in the 1990s, and still available, I believe, by subscription for anyone willing to fork out, I believe it's $42,000 US for I don't know how many cabinets of microfiche. Leopoldo Chickanyara, whose dates are 1767 to 1834, and there he is on the screen, was an art historian who assembled a collection of some 5,000 early imprints in the field of art and archaeology. His library, now considered the foundational literature of art and archaeology, was eventually sold to the Vatican, where it now remains. It may well have been an inspiration to Charles Eastlake in building his own library. He certainly had a copy of Chickanyara's 2-volume inventory, the Catalogo Ragionato di Libri Dati e d'Antichità, which was published in 1821 and often reprinted since. The Digital Chikanyara Library is an international initiative aiming to recreate the Chikanyara Library in digital form. The site currently features the 1821 Cataloga Ragionato, combined with modern bibliographic descriptions, plus a limited number of images. When complete, the application will consist of the full text of the Catalogo, integrated with digital images and full text of every title in the corpus, including black and white facsimiles of the original volumes in the Vatican Library, plus one or more high-resolution colour scans of unique copies owned and digitised by partner libraries, and detailed bibliographic information. The copy-specific characteristics of the newly digitised volumes will provide new information about the early modern literature of art and its readership, Chikanyara's own reception and his impact on historical scholarship, and the development of research libraries. The Digital Chikanyara project seeks to promote the digitisation of copies in various libraries, and the National Gallery Library is participating. Our holdings of pre-1821 titles have already been checked against the Chikanyara catalogue. Depending upon the findings and requirements of the Digital Chikanyara project, we hope to be in a position to digitise some unique or rare titles from the Eastlake collection in the near future. Fifthly, publication, getting our own research out there. The work of cataloguing the rare books in the Eastlake Library has fed into a long article which I wrote for the National Gallery's Scholarly Technical Bulletin. Charles Eastlake's most influential publication was entitled Materials for a History of Oil Painting, published in 1847, and I'll call it Materials for short. This book, Materials, came about as a result of a series of historical events. In 1843, the old Palace of Westminster was destroyed by fire, and designs for the replacement Houses of Parliament by Charles Barry were eventually selected. In 1841, Eastlake was appointed Secretary of the Royal Fine Arts Commission, with the task of finding artists to decorate the interiors of the new building. There was considerable interest in the idea of using fresco techniques, and at the same time, concern that the decorations should be made to last. In 1842, the year after, the National Gallery acquired Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini wedding portrait, a painting whose remarkable state of preservation inspired all kinds of theories about lost, secret painting techniques of the Van Eyck brothers. 5 years later, in 1847, and very much as a culmination of this process, Eastlake published the first volume of his Materials for a History of Oil Painting. Eastlake was a practicing painter himself. He was very knowledgeable about technique, and in Materials he explicitly sets out to demystify any, quote, absurd hypotheses, unquote. As John Ruskin put it in the Quarterly Review for 1848, quote, he's done away with all legends of forgotten secrets, unquote. As part of the demystification process, Eastlake's research involved consulting and quoting numerous 16th century books of secrets, usually compilations of technical and medicinal recipes, which frequently contained relevant information about alchemy, dyeing, and the making of oils and cosmetics. These volumes were typically hard to find, and so rather than trying to acquire them for his own library, Eastlake consulted them at the British Museum. Nevertheless, one comparable volume in the library is a painter's manual published in Leipzig in 1532. A remarkably clean copy, given that most surviving copies knocked around in painters' workshops for generations until they simply fell apart. When it came to tracking down obscure publications outside his own collection, conveniently, Eastlake had not only been librarian of the Royal Academy from 1842 to 1844, he also became president of the Royal Academy from 1850 until his death. And even better, during that period of the 1850s, 1860s, the Academy and the National Gallery shared the same building on Trafalgar Square, so he undoubtedly used the RA Library to supplement his own personal collection. The printed sources which did contribute to the writing of Materials include standard biographical works, such as Vasari's Lives. This is the second edition of 1568, but he also collected the first edition of 1550. He was a scrupulous and methodical reader, and comparing multiple editions. His documentary sources include not only published works, but also manuscripts. By the time he was writing in the 1840s, a fair number of the manuscripts critical for the history of painting had already been edited and published as a result of antiquarian interest. Perhaps the best known of these is Cennino Cennini's Il Libro dell'Arte, probably written in the late 1390s. And the library includes the English translation by Mary Merrifield with a very colourful frontispiece. Mary Merrifield, 1804 to 1889, was a particularly important collaborator in Eastlake's research, travelling to France and northern Italy in order to transcribe and copy manuscripts in libraries and archives. 2 years after Materials, her own landmark publication, Original Treatises, appeared in 1849. Perhaps the most notable manuscript discussed in Materials is known as the Strasbourg manuscript, dating from the 15th century. In the 1840s, Eastlake acquired a manuscript copy from a friend. There it is, again with the E stamp on. A few decades later, in 1870, fire destroyed the Strasbourg Public Library, taking with it the original manuscript, with the result that Eastlake's handwritten copy became the sole carrier of the text. Materials was a highly successful publication, in spite of the fact that Eastlake died before he could complete Volume 2. Amazingly, it was still in print in an Italian translation at the end of the 20th century. My technical bulletin article explores the role played by Charles Eastlake's library in the research and writing of Materials, and it has been another way to raise the profile of the library both within the institution and outside. As for the decoration of the Houses of Parliament, well, in the event, fresco turned out to be more suited to sunny Tuscany than the muddy banks of the Thames. Along the way, though, Eastlake's research allowed him to draw attention to the technical affinities between, quote, the English painters in the 14th century and the followers of Giotto, unquote, which was presumably an encouraging thought. Finally, creating opportunities, a collaborative doctoral partnership. We seek to encourage others to carry out research on our own collections as well. And to this end, we've entered into a partnership with the Department of Information Management at Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen, where Professor Peter Reid has expertise in the field of library history. The National Gallery is recognised by the Arts and Humanities Research Council as an independent research organisation. Together with Robert Gordon, we will be co-supervising a doctoral student working towards her PhD by carrying out research on the subject of art history scholarship between the 1820s and the 1870s, the role of the Eastlake Library at the National Gallery. She will be exploring the part played by the library in supporting Eastlake as a scholar and a museum director, as well as the international context for emerging specialist art libraries in the 19th century. This is an area ripe for further study. Evidence for the historical evolution of the specialist art library does exist in the form of surviving libraries, such as those of Chickenyarra and Eastlake, or in the form of published and unpublished catalogues. But the documentation is scattered, and no attempt has yet been made to synthesize it or draw conclusions about how these libraries supported, advanced, and shaped the intellectual environment of their personal or institutional owners and readers. I'm not sure how easy that is to read, but there it is. One of the mechanisms by which the project will get underway is to compile a list of relevant historical art libraries deserving of investigation, whether extant or dispersed, and a corresponding bibliography of library catalogues. In the UK, this would include the libraries of individuals, such as the personal and professional libraries of Sir John Soane, Joshua Reynolds, the artist J.M.W. Turner, writers like John Ruskin, museum administrators, not only Charles Eastlake, but the libraries of his predecessor as Keeper of the National Gallery, William Seeger, and his colleague, Ralph Nicholson Warnham, who had previously been librarian for the Government School of Design. There's also documentation of relevant country house libraries, such as that of Horace Walpole at Strawberry Hill, and the Brownlow family at Belton Hall. Institutional libraries, well, the Royal Academy is probably the most significant, but there's also some evidence for the formation of libraries at the National Gallery of Scotland and the National Gallery of Ireland. Turning to continental Europe, as mentioned earlier, Count Leopoldo Chickenyarra assembled the most extensive individual library, but there's also that of the collector Consul Joseph Smith in Venice, catalogued as the Bibliotheca Smithiana. Other relevant library collectors may be well known, such as Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, or less well known, such as Count Stanislaus Kostka-Potocki, whose library is at the University of Warsaw. The Memofonte Foundation in Florence has gathered documents of various Italian art libraries belonging to Maffeo Pinelli, Tommaso Pacini, and Francesco Longena, for example. There are also continental institutional libraries such as the Uffizi in Florence, the Biblioteca Pubblica di Siena, and the Stadel Institute in Frankfurt, under the direction of Eastlake's friend and colleague Johann David Passavant. And finally, moving into the period just post-Eastlake, it would be impossible not to mention the Henry Cole's Universal Catalogue of Books on Art, issued by the South Kensington Museum in 1870. In terms of the academic impact of this collaborative doctoral project, therefore, the objective is to go beyond the straightforward history of the Eastlake Library in two ways. On the one hand, the project will provide pointers towards the detailed study of other art libraries and their roles. On the other, it will be guided by the concept of new library history, posited by Professor Alistair Black in 1996. New library history takes the view that studying the history of libraries goes beyond the focus on one or more libraries to study the history of broader society and its cultural and intellectual manifestations through the history of one or more libraries. Black calls for the idea that reference back to past purpose, not just practice, helps define the aims of present-day provision. Indeed, at a time when librarians, and this is a quote from Black, I should say, continuing, at a time when librarians are expressing deep anxiety concerning their identities and roles, defining purpose is surely a premium. Historical consciousness is indispensable to the process of defining the rationale and philosophy of any organisation, a library included. End quote. Eastlake's public and scholarly life mean that an examination of his books offers a wider understanding of broader societal and cultural issues, approaches very much in line with this direction. Art libraries are an integral part of the history of art history. Our hope is that other art librarians will be inspired to explore the history of their libraries, and this in turn will assist them in convincing their institutions of the historical and ongoing value of the library to their programmes and projects. Thank you very much.
Our next two speakers are Cathy Johns, who is a librarian at the Royal College of Art, and she is speaking with Tanveer Ahmed, who is a visiting lecturer in critical historical studies for fashion and textiles at the Royal College of Art, and is also a PhD candidate at the Open University. There you go.
Not a librarian.
Do you want to go next?
Yeah.
All right. Hello, I'm Cathy. Thanks for coming today. There's a fantastic link I've just spotted. I had no idea Jonathan was going to end on the Universal Catalogue of books to be used in art colleges from 1870. And of course, the Royal College of Art started at the V&A in the 19th century. And so there's a lovely link there from what we're going to talk about today from the ending of your talk there.
Brilliant. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming here, and it's great to be here. So, as I was introduced, my name is Tanveer Ahmed, and I've taught fashion design for a long time now in London, mostly in further and higher education institutions, and I'm currently teaching at the Royal College of Art. So I'm teaching historical and critical studies to postgraduate fashion and textile students. So essentially I'm helping them with their dissertations, so with writing, even though I'm a practice-based person, normally haven't taught fashion practice. Alongside this, I'm also doing a PhD. So for a long time, teaching fashion, I started to get quite kind of angry really at the way that fashion is dominated by Western thinking. And so I started to do this PhD, and I've been testing out different pedagogical experiments to think about how fashion could be taught in a way to challenge that thinking. So I'm in my 4th year of 6-year part-time PhD, and I'm studying at the Open University, which is in the UK. So in my PhD research, I'm looking at ways to challenge prevailing Eurocentrism in fashion design education. And so Eurocentrism, meaning the tendency to interpret the world in terms of the values and experiences of Europeans or Anglo-Americans, and by extension, the West. So through my research, I'm looking for ways to retell fashion design with a more pluralistic narrative, rather than with a singular dominant European and Anglo-American, Western, global North narrative. So today's presentation will focus on a project that was run as part of the MA History of Design course at the Royal College of Art in their library in Kensington in London, and this took place a few months ago in March. So just wanted to start by giving a bit of context for why this project took place. So the context was that in January of this year, the Royal College of Art Student Union organised an event called Decolonising the institution in response to calls from their own students, as well as wider global student-led campaigns, which are demanding the decolonisation of higher education. I was asked to participate because of my research focus and a Women of Colour reading group that I co-facilitate with students there. The student demands focus on the need for universities to acknowledge the historical and ongoing legacy of structural and epistemological coloniality. UK-wide campaigns have included the call to remove statues that celebrate colonialists, renaming buildings, diversifying reading lists, and the need to increase the representation of non-white staff. This has been reflected in curriculum changes in the Royal College's History of Design department, who have started a new module called Decolonising Fashion, and they've also initiated a Decolonising Reading Week for students. I was invited in to both speak to History of Design students about my research that I presented earlier on at a conference called Non-Western Fashion, and I was asked to run a half-day project that put these theories of decolonisation into practice. And it's something that I'm very aware needs to happen as part of any decolonising process, that it's not just talking about things, but actually doing something.
So I've worked at the Royal College of Art Library since 2002, and I've been responsible for supporting both fashion and textiles and history of design in the library since about 2005. The relatively intimate size of the library reflects the standalone nature of the RCA as an independent university, and its collections reflect the fact that it is entirely postgraduate. The downside of its smallness is that we have a limited budget for resources, technology and facilities compared with libraries in larger institutional contexts. The upside is that being small and specifically art and design focused, we offer a responsive and in many cases individually tailored service for students. We get to know our students really well, we get to know what they're doing, and we can engage very closely with what's going on in their practice and research. Although our numbers have expanded rapidly since I started, and pertinently to this talk, our traditional European UK demographic has shifted in favour of a large student body from Asian countries, Korea, Japan and China. We still get to know our students well, of course, and we can really engage in a generative and proactive way with their interests, both in terms of reflecting these interests and maintaining a close relationship with academic staff and student developments and the zeitgeist of the college, as well as my own personal and professional interests. Because of this, I'm able to engage actively with the opportunities and challenges that the burgeoning interest in decolonising the curriculum that has grown in significance, in particular this year in the college, challenging the traditionally white male Eurocentric focus of perhaps the most prestigious art college in the UK. Someone can challenge that if they want, but... So the library has always been a key point of reference and a rich resource for history of design students. The course is run jointly with the Victoria and Albert Museum, and students also use the V&A's National Art Library, of course, for their research. Both resources support these students, but in the RCA library, we offer a lending service and also an interactive research support and a context in which a dialogue-based project such as this can take place. The project was an ideal opportunity for the library to engage, use its collections and facilities to engage closely with crucial student concerns and developments in academic practice at the college. In this case, the decolonising movement in the library. And also take a look at ourselves, very crucially, which I'm going to talk about later. Take a look at what we're doing in the library in a sometimes uncomfortable way. The project, the debate around decolonising the curriculum, as I say, has offered a really important wake-up call to us as library workers for the library to be aware of and embedded in the radar of the college in terms of hosting materials in the library for academic use. And I can only say that I couldn't make it to the Decolonising symposium that happened, but I've watched it streamed afterwards, and I can only say that the next time I'm going to be right in the front row of that symposium. Since the 1970s, of course, there's been much activism and debate about the notion of the library as a potential site of subversive activity. I remember when I was running, I'm quite old, I remember when I was running Feminist Book Week activities in Camden Public Libraries in the early 80s. Who remembers that? The library, there have been radical library movements for a very long time. It's not a new thing, that question the notion of the neutrality of the library and its collections, of course. Notable voices articulating these kind of challenge include Sanford Berman, who worked tirelessly to unpack and challenge inherent bias in classification systems, and more recently Melissa Adler in this field. Brian Rosenblum has published usefully on the implications of the decolonising movement in academic libraries, also taking into account the so-called neutrality of the digital humanities, noting the archival silences even in the digital world, or perhaps especially in the digital world. Nina de Jesus has written from a more radical activist standpoint. Librarians are writing on all sorts of aspects of this movement, including inclusive citation, addressing and recommending the positive citing of diverse references in academic writing, and interrogating both Edward Said's Orientalism on the neutrality of knowledge and echoing Safia Noble's recent book, Algorithms of Oppression, which looks at bias in search engines, in how we could perhaps address questions of the privileging of certain sorts of knowledge in our collections and services. More recently, the art library in particular has been interrogated as a site of resistance and an enabler of radical institutional and social critique. The blog Decolonising, have we got the Decolonising design quote? Sorry. Maybe not. Okay, sorry. The blog Decolonizing Design, for instance, actively calls for institutional change, and I interpret this as implicating the library as part of a design institution to actively take up the challenge. A key symposium, as some of you who are here today may have been to, a key symposium took place in May 2018 at Chelsea College, London, towards a critical art librarianship, in which, as well as an inspiring keynote address by Emily Drabinski on critical approaches to our work, powerful voices spoke on archiving alternative histories, zines as alternative material in academia, the active addressing of inequality in so-called neutral sources of information such as Wikipedia, and hacking the library catalogue. It was an amazing session. It's interesting that this activity, though, is still seen very much as an undercurrent rather than mainstream, although I think this conference, these 2 days, has perhaps changed that a bit. The latest, I hope there's nobody here from the publishing of the Handbook of Art and Design Librarianship. The latest edition of the definitive Handbook of Art and Design Librarianship does not include one reference to critical or radical librarianship in practice in art libraries. Recent debates about decolonising the curriculum have clearly implicated the library within the academic institution as a key site of activity, contesting hegemonic systems of knowledge and canons of knowledge. It's become evident that the library must be seen as embedded in any project of curriculum decolonising, both in acknowledging its own non-neutral position as a gatekeeper of knowledge and as offering the opportunity for radical learning to take place outside the classroom, harnessing the power of independent, unfettered and collaborative learning. This project at the RCA allowed these radical library interests to engage with more general activism towards decolonising the curriculum of the RCA, and the question of how the library can respond to the notion of decolonising fashion history in particular sparked a really interesting dialogue between Tanveer and myself. What were the issues here in addressing the library as complicit in supporting particular constructions of knowledge?
Some of those references there as well. So what I wanted to say was talk a little bit now about what the fashion culture is like in libraries in general, particularly from my perspective as a tutor. So against this backdrop of all these debates, it's still difficult for the collections in art and design libraries to escape the dominance of Eurocentric thinking and cultures. So from a teaching perspective, encouraging students to use the library as much as possible can therefore be problematic. Let's take make Vogue magazine a useful resource for fashion and design students. While there are currently 23 international editions of the magazine, for example, Vogue Arabia, Vogue India, Vogue Mexico and Latin America, for example, most higher education art and design libraries in the UK carry just a few editions, although there are increasing numbers of both international and black and minority ethnic home students, as Cathy said. The Vogue editions stock tend to not just be from the global north, but mostly Northern Europe and America. So you're likely to only see UK Vogue and Vogue Paris, seen here at the Royal College of Art. Perhaps at other institutions you might see Italian Vogue, very occasionally Vogue Japan or Vogue Europe, but that's the kind of narrative that you're going to see when you enter into a library space. Can you say something here, Cathy, about these?
Yeah, these are some examples on the left. This is some examples of how we might think about the kind of content that we have in the library. On the left, you can see there have been initiatives in mainstream publishing to address the concept of perhaps a less Eurocentric view of fashion history, and you can see some of the published material there. On the left, we have all of those obviously in the library, and people such as Angela Jensen and others have usefully addressed some of the gaps in this history. On the right, though, you can perhaps see some of the sort of more under-the-radar materials that we might be more interested in recommending to our students, as well as in tandem with those books on the left, such as the Shades of Noir project and Depatriarchize Design there, and Decolonizing design websites.
So, to further unpack the debates at the centre of decolonizing theories, it's useful to look to Nelson Maldonado Torres's article on the coloniality of being. This quote, which says that coloniality survives colonialism, is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of people, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. This quote's important because what Maldonado Torres is explaining here is that while the process of decolonisation for the majority, not all countries, has taken place, with self-rule returning to places like India after centuries of colonial rule, the legacy of colonialism still survives. And in the context of design history, the ways in which cultures are constructed show how colonial thinking, known as coloniality, still persists. So we'll talk now about what the project actually was. So the inspiration for this project came from the site-specific installation artwork called the British Library House 2014. Some of you may have seen it. It was situated in Brighton Museum's Old Reference Library, and it was by the British artist Yinka Shonibare. In this work, Shonibare used wax cloth to bind books to highlight the contribution of refugees and immigrants to British culture, identifying individuals such as Kazuo Ishiguro, Zaha Hadid, Amartya Sen, Sena Anish Kapoor and many more. I like the way that by recovering these books in wax cloth, the books shifted from being seen as neutral or passive, but as something much more dynamic and alive to contemporary debates about what British means. This resonated with my research and offered me a way to interrogate how resources for design students are so often simply accepted without question of their role in the circuit of knowledge construction. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about what's on the shelves at the Royal College of Art Library from a teaching perspective again. So while these photographs of the shelves in the fashion design section in the Royal College of Art Library were taken on a random day, so they can't claim to be fully representative of the collections, what these images do offer is an overall sense of the kinds of narratives at work that show how knowledge of fashion histories is constructed in art and design libraries. So this first shelf here, we can see that There's books, for example, I don't know how clear you can see, but there's books about, for example, tribal art and rugs, and in amongst it you'll also see books about, tribal and village rugs, and we'll see also another book across art and fashion. So it's this kind of orientalist kind of sense of all these books being placed together that are other books about fashion. So when we do come to have a look at the fashion books, we'll see this idea of celebration of individual designers. It's also very gendered. So we'll see Martin Margiela, Alexander McQueen. We'll see lots of books about a sole genius fashion designer. And what we'll also notice about these books, so for example we see Yves Saint Laurent, for example, we'll see that they're mostly all Western European. We do see some women there, so it's not fully gendered. We will see, for example, I think there's Zandra Rose and Elsa Schiaparelli, but again these are Western European women. And when we do go to see books about a more wider narrative about, let's say, global fashion histories, we'll see them all bunched together, which kind of it creates a binary of the West and the non-West. It also homogenises difference. It kind of irons out everything that's different into one big lump. So we get kind of Asian designers alongside Chinese designers, Tokyo designers, and it's working in this particular way.
That's our wake-up call, by the way, those photos. However, there are reasons for that. So I was approached by Tanveer with the idea of hosting the Decolonising fashion project in the library. I think you saw a display I'd done about when Linda Nochlin died earlier this year, and I thought we have to mark this in the library. And you noticed it and you thought, there's somebody in the library who's interested in that kind of those kind of feminist issues. So we discussed the ways in which we felt the library would be key to the project in advance. For the project itself, the students came into the library. We had a conversation about how the materials and the content of the library are sourced, the way they are displayed, the way they are searched for in the library, the search systems, and also about taxonomies of knowledge and the challenge of hosting alternative and diverse voices. And I know that word diverse is a contested one, so I use it carefully there. Diverse voices in academia. Whose voices are heard and whose voices are silent, we asked. We thought about how mainstream publishing treats fashion and how we might encourage a wider exploration of a more heterogeneous range of materials and resources. I invited them to identify and think about the archival silences in our material. So, have we got the Emily Drabinski slide next? It's the next one. This is just a fantastic quote from Emily Drabinski from her keynote speech at the Critical Librarianship event at Chelsea. If anybody hasn't seen her, she put her entire presentation on her blog. It's really worth reading for anybody who's working in the field, I think. So that was our sort of starting point, really.
So the project consisted of two activities. Activity 1 involved students undertaking content analysis of the books in the fashion history section of the library to help them identify how fashion history knowledge has been and continues to be constructed. So to begin, students took a selection of 10 books from the shelves using either random, stratified or systematic sampling methods. Next, students were asked to devise categories for analysis based on what we had been speaking about in terms of classification and knowledge construction. So, for example, students were asked to consider issues such as author gender, author nationality, and subject matter, for example. They were also asked to devise categories based on absences, such as which author nationalities were absent, for example, authors originating from African countries. Once the categories had been devised, it was simply a case of counting and inserting numbers into these boxes to identify what the dominant narratives at work in the library's fashion history collection were and were not. So then the second activity consisted of students working in pairs to rewrite new fashion histories that need to be told as they're currently absent from the dominant narratives. So students were given a selection of old National Geographic magazines to cut and paste markers and books which have been covered in plain white paper, ready for a new cover. There was lots of enthusiasm and energy for this second part of the project, with students using their creativity and imagination to challenge what their content analysis results had shown them. The books were then put on display in the library for a week.
It was a salutary experience for us to see that our collections of material were so carefully and professionally curated by us, interrogated in this way, and to see it in a completely new way. We were very excited about the idea of queering the mainstream fashion canon.
So here are some of the covers that the students' pairs produced. I can talk about them later about why they specifically did them, but the first one was called Emerging Myanmar Fashion. The next one was fashion written in Japanese language that opened in the opposite way to English language, so it opened from the back. There was global gender fluid dress pre-21st century. The next one was the age of fashion, fashion after the age of 50. There was fashion in families, and as you can see, it's a family that challenges your heteronormative family there. It's got 2 cats. And a history of women's everyday clothing, and they crossed out the word global here.
So I think in terms of future directions, we're obviously in the early stage of addressing this challenge. One of the things that we have done, which is quite useful, is to make sure that our periodical collection reflects the more under-the-radar titles, not just the mainstream fashion publications. We've got Galdem, which is excellent, which is something which was suggested by the Women of Colour reading group that Tanveer organises. We also last year had a feminist society at the RCA, which was fantastic, so we had some dialogue with them about the kinds of things that we could have. They had a zine exhibition in the library that was brilliant. All of those things, we need to make space in our professional practice, our practice as library workers, I'd rather say, I think, to think about how we can address the archival silences that exist in our collections. What do we want next year? Yeah. So we've got a lot of things to think about, as you can see. I have to emphasise here that this is a work in progress, as change, as institutional change and as critical librarianship is. It's definitely something that we're going to be thinking about a lot in the future. We need to think about the way we work together as a team, as well as our material, which I've talked quite a bit about. We need to think about perhaps sourcing different sorts of material from different voices. I was really, really impressed this morning at the discussion of zines and the discussion of alternative publishing models and the way, and I was particularly impressed by, I think it was Kirsty, no, it was Jessa Mockridge, who said we need to stop using Amazon. Yes. So we need to think about that. We need to think about where does our material come from. We need to also think about whose voices are we hosting in the library. We also need to think about how we enable our users to find things in the library. We need to think about our search and discovery systems. We need to think about how they also are constructed in accordance with inbuilt canons of power and authority. We need to think about ourselves. We need to think about how we behave with our users, with our students, and with our community. And we need to think about also how we can effectively use the library as a space for interrogating systems of power and knowledge. We also need to think about making sure that we embed a really collaborative dialogue with academics and with students in absolutely everything we do. It's not just about buying some books, some diverse books on fashion history. It's actually about thinking how we do everything we do every day in the library. Do you want to talk about some?
I mean, I think that what this project has really helped me think about is these kinds of initiatives. So it's starting a dialogue between Cathy and myself, between students and Cathy, and it's really changed a lot of for me, the culture of teaching, if I know that there could be more initiatives around Feminist Reading Week, for example, and things like this. Okay. Thank
We'd
you.
love to hear any ideas from all of you about how we can move forward with this.
I was just curious to know whether either at the National Gallery or at the Royal College of Art Library you considered web archiving as, sort of in terms of library institutional history and preserving that for, future scholarship, and then also bringing in more voices and more diverse voices. Certainly a lot of conversations are happening online, so that might be a location for content.
Yes, well, we had a conversation at lunchtime.
Yeah.
So the answer is the National Gallery. I'm not aware of any specific web archiving initiative at the moment, but it's something I do have some experience of in another institution. So I will raise it with the archivist when I get back.
And no, we have a digital archive of student work, obviously, that's maintained by our special collections librarian, but no, we haven't up till now, but it's an interesting idea, yeah.
Thank you. Your question.
I just wanted to thank all of you. It's really inspiring. And yesterday I was thinking about what our students see on the shelves and how it only represents just that much of the world. But I think the reference to the historical canon of knowledge is really important because students can see the absences when looking at the historical books, but your activity in the stats is already got my mind thinking. It's just really inspiring, so thank you all.
Well, I've got a question for Cathy and Tanveer about these future initiatives, because it's something we're trying to do at Huddersfield at the moment, driven by our student union, because they've just recruited BAME ambassadors from every department to kind of challenge the colonial nature of curriculums, and the library's getting really involved. So I wanted to ask you how, as librarians, we can kind of make this happen and kind of get people on board with it.
I think we need to keep dialogues going with the people who need to be on our side. We need to talk to our library managers, and we need to talk to staff, and we need to talk to students. We need to keep those lines of dialogue. We need to think about where we, as I said in the presentation, where do we get the voices from who are speaking in our libraries? How do we find the material? We need to think about other sources of information really that we're offering students. And we need to think in our information literacy sessions about how we recommend wider reading, not just sticking to the reading list that they've been given, but thinking about a more lateral way of looking at information sources and accessing other voices on fashion history. And I think, at the moment, the History of Design course tends to be a bit like the art history course that I did, which was mostly white, middle-class women. So I think the more resources that we can host which represent a different picture of design history, the more it's likely that demographic hopefully will change.
So kind of having that as adding things to your library collection and then trying to promote it to the people doing the teaching, so they're aware and making it part of what they're considering telling students. So that idea of just keeping a dialogue going.
And I think I'd just like to add from a teaching perspective, a lot of these calls for decolonising the curriculum in the UK. We've got why is my curriculum white, we've got why isn't my professor black. Lots of these campaigns, well, all of them are student-led, so they're bottom-up led. And what the students are saying is that the curriculum isn't responding to their calls. We've got a situation where we've got a lot of educators who have been educated in reproducing Eurocentric thinking who are stuck. Now, in amongst them, there are some, but we're a minority of educators who are trying to challenge that system. But it's not, I don't think it's happening in the classroom, or if it is, it's happening in very, very small ways. So, which is why you're getting even more student campaigns and you're getting a lot of unrest on campuses. And that's where I think a place like the library has got a lot of potential as this kind of space where you could actually almost, I think personally, it can actually offer a lot more scope than the classroom, you know, the traditional classroom, because it's a space that doesn't have assessment criteria. It doesn't have those neoliberal structures in the same way that your curriculum has. I can do group work in this project. I can't do group work easily when it comes to assessment because the neoliberal structure says I've got to assess each student individually. I totally disagree with marking. It's a really problematic system, and I've got to label them a grade. So how do you do a decolonised kind of thinking in that structure? The two clash completely. But doing a workshop in the library doesn't. You can do things there. So I think that having this dialogue shows you that there are lots of spaces. So I co-run this Women of Colour reading group, and we've had the reading group in the canteen. We've had it in all these different spaces which exist almost in this in-between space that isn't necessarily the institution, but it's not outside of the institution either. And there's a lot of, I think, agency in those spaces.
And I think also talking to publishers, like we were this morning.
Yes.
We were both talking to Bloomsbury this morning about their digital resources, and it's keeping that dialogue going, telling those publishers this is actually what students want. This is what they need.
Yeah.
So,
Give us different content.
give us different voices.
Be more radical in what you're choosing to put in your databases, and that will make it something we want.
That just sparked a question. Have either of you considered, Cathy, either collecting or Tanveer, using in your teaching open education resources as a way to diversify the collection or provide access to something that perhaps doesn't get the same opportunity when it has to jump through those publisher groups?
Not yet. Have you? I mean, do you mean what sort of things do you
Things
mean?
that are freely available online. So more digital things that are published or things that don't have to go through an institution to access.
I do all the time because I don't find the resources that I want, the sort of idea of fashion that I'm trying to teach, which I call anti-racist, anti-capitalist. I don't find it in a book on Chanel. So I'd use a lot of social media, a lot of blogs, and to teach with that as my resource.
That's great.
And in our information literacy workshops, obviously, that comes up as well in those, and we can engage with those sources in those as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the challenge of resources, and those of us who have long memories, the challenge that we had when we were trying to transform our history away from the male Western canon.
Absolutely.
And one of the challenges there was that you would take photographs yourself of the materials, and the photographs always had stigma attached to them because they looked less than the hotly produced images that were in the standard canonical. Often they were from, grainy black and white reproductions, things like that. And trying to educate students to the value of that, like, that's an important image because it's about certain kind of markers of how it comes into observation. Anyway, that's a comment, but so I think talking to publishers really, really important. It changed the children's literature world dramatically.
Yes.
Because publishers were so afraid of dealing with, Heather has two mommies, or, and it really, people of color and so forth. But I'm wondering what's at stake, and this is a true question, not a kind of like a answer, a real question, which is what's at stake in keeping the term fashion in play as opposed to clothing? Because to me, as a woman, I've always found fashion so oppressive. It's always been hegemonic. It's always been the thing that makes me feel inadequate in every single way, right? And I mean, not everybody feels that way, right? So there's a way to claim fashion differently from a street perspective or something, but I'm just wondering for you, like, is fashion the term you can use proactively, or is it a term that also needs some kind of authentication.
So there's a lot of writing about whether we should use fashion or if we should use clothing. Often in the first term when I teach students in the first year of undergraduate, I'll say like, how do you feel if you did a degree in clothing? And everyone all kind of feels quite uncomfortable with this work. But lots of the theories say that the binary has been created between fashion as a concept of modernity thinking and clothing being used as something to do with more traditional communities and costume and that kind of thing. So for me personally, I want to use fashion to reclaim it. So there are people that use, slightly change it. Somebody uses the word fashionalisation, her name's Sandra Neeson. So they're kind of all anti-fashion. These kind of words to say that the binary was wrong because all communities globally have always had change. So fashion is really a word of change. So as soon as you take away, if you reduce fashion down to clothing, then it takes away that agency of change. So there's this idea that the focus is more on addressing the inequality that non-Western communities were not allowed, they were disallowed from having that term, and to bring them back in and to rethink what the term means. So that seems to me where it's at, but I completely see, but there are a whole, I do know some people who actively say let's stop using that word because of the problems of its oppression.
Excellent. I just had a question for you, Jonathan, because I've worked in the past in roles involving digitisation of quite discrete collections and things, and it's always that issue of where do you start, what do you pick to do first. So how do you go about that at the National Gallery in terms of your digitisation programme?
Well, certainly, as I mentioned, looking at what other people have done, I mean, there is no point, for the most part, digitising books that other people have digitised, unless we have copies that are annotated or special in some way. So we look at what's out there already. As I mentioned, the early catalogues of the gallery turned out nobody digitised those, and those are useful to have online. For the Chiconyara project, we have certain things which we know, well, as far as we know, are unique copies. So we obviously would intend to digitise those ahead of other things that can be found elsewhere.
Do you kind of take into account what people using your library are wanting to look at, and then considering that as kind of prioritisations for...
Yes, but also, in a sense, I think, useful follow digitisation, and that we have things that nobody else has and they haven't been digitised until they're digitised and known about. And I'll give you an example. Charles Eastlake collected guidebooks extensively. We have, I think it's from 1774 or something, a guidebook to a tiny shrine really in Italy, which had artworks in it. And the guidebook itself, I think, came out in many editions, but an Italian researcher found out that we had the only copy, it seems to exist, of the 1773 edition. And so I have no idea how he found that out, but he found it out somehow. So that's the kind of thing we would digitise, because then more people would know that we had it.
People are sometimes better researchers than we are. So that's really interesting. I'd love to come and visit the National Gallery Library at some time. Any more questions? Okay, well, you'll all be pleased to know that we finished the session really early, and you've all now got half an hour before the lightning talks start at 2:30. So I'm definitely going to run my hands under a cold tap and get a nice room.